If this is the first time you're watching my video, make sure you hit the subscribe button. Please turn on the notification so that you get the latest updates. Hi, in today's session, we will see how to configure a vendor master. The main objective of today's session is to see the configuration of vendor master. So vendor master is also known as a business partner in SAP because the vendor is actually supplying the materials, and he becomes a partner to our business. So another name for vendor master is also business partner. A vendor is also referred to as a goods supplier because he supplies the goods. And if a vendor is doing subcontracting, then he can be referred to as a subcontracting vendor. If a vendor is a service provider, we refer them to as a service vendor. Now, this is a screenshot of a vendor display. Okay. When you look at the vendor display, there are different types of data in a vendor master. So if you see here, you have the general data, you have the company code data, and you have the purchase organization data. Under each of these types of data, if you see, for example, under general data, if you see, you have the details of the vendor address, the payment transactions, and the contact person. Under the company code data, you have details like accounting information, payment transactions, correspondence, and withholding tax details. Under the purchase org data, you have details like purchasing related data and partner functions. Okay. Now, if you want to create a vendor, there are three different ways by which you can create a vendor using three different transaction codes. If the vendor is created by the master data team, that is, you're creating the vendor centrally, where you're creating all the three different types of data, then you can use the transaction code XK01. That means whenever the master data team is creating the vendor master, they have all the relevant information related to purchasing and finance, plus the details of all the vendor, like the vendor address, payment transactions, contact person, etc. So they can go ahead and use XK01 and create the vendor master centrally. Now, if in certain companies, let's say the purchasing department creates the purchasing related data, or the finance department creates the finance related data, then the purchasing department would use the transaction code MK01 and put in the relevant data related to the purchasing activities. Okay. Now, for the same vendor, the finance department has to go and input the finance related data. Now, once the purchase data and finance data are available, the master data team can go and fill in the rest of the data and complete the vendor master. Okay. So there are different ways by which the vendor can be created in SAP. The ideal practice or the general practice is to route all the data to a central team called the master data team, where you can provide all the necessary information so that the central team can create the vendor master in SAP. Whenever you're creating the vendor master in SAP, you would be creating for a particular company code and for a particular purchase organization. Now, the vendor, if you see on the left-hand side, you can have the vendor number generate automatically by setting up the number range, or automatically setting the number range, which is called an internal number range, or you can set up an external number range where you can input the vendor number when you're creating the vendor master. So the best practice is to always have the vendor master or the vendor number generated automatically, okay, by the system. So you always define an internal number range. Now, there are different types of vendors. So depending on what kind of vendors you have, there are SAP defined standard vendors, but depending on what kind of vendors you need, if those SAP defined standard vendors are not listed, then you can create your own vendors. For example, you have the fixed vendors. If you're procuring materials from certain vendors, then you can procure the materials from these vendors. They're called fixed vendors. For all the regular materials that you procure, for example, the raw materials, you can use the regular vendors, classify them as regular vendors. If it's a service related procurement and you're procuring service related items from the vendor, you can procure from the service vendor. If you're only going to procure items from the vendors for on one time basis, then you can use the vendor as a one time vendor. Now if you want to procure materials from outside your country, so you can import those materials and you can refer to those vendors as an international vendor. And the vendors that are there in within your country, you can refer to them as a domestic vendors. So depending on the client's requirement or the customer's requirement, you can configure the different types of vendors in SAP. Now, if you see the SAP transaction codes, you have create vendor that is centrally using XK01. You have change vendor using XK02. You have display vendor using XK03. Now, if someone makes changes to the vendor master, and at any point of time you would like to know what are the changes that have been um, made for a particular vendor, then you can use the transaction code XK04, put in the vendor number, and fill in the rest of the details, and then look who has changed the vendor master data and when they have changed. So all these details are captured in SAP. Now, for some reason, you want to block a vendor. Let's take an example. So when you procure a material and there is some dispute in the quality of material, or there is any dispute that is under discussion, for some time you want to block the vendor. You don't want the purchase department to start placing materials on this particular vendor, or there are some financial dispute which is being negotiated and you don't want new orders to be placed, then you can block the vendor temporarily using XK05. Now, suppose if you want to delete any vendor for any reason, then you can use the transaction code XK06 where you flag for deletion. In SAP, you really don't delete any data, but you mark them for deletion or you flag them for deletion. So there is a checkbox that will get ticked, which marks it for deletion. But physically, the data will be existing because you would have procured certain materials using that particular vendor and you don't want to delete the vendor because there is some old data that is already available in SAP. So in SAP, most of the times you will only flag it for deletion or mark it for deletion. Now, if you want to know a list of vendors, you can use the transaction code MKVZ and find out the list of vendors. Once you log into SAP using your user ID and password, you can go to the transaction SPRO. And once you go to SPRO, click on this SAP reference IMG or use the function key F5. And once you enter the configuration area, scroll down to logistics general area. Now click on this arrow and look for the word business partner. So if you come down to the business partner, you have customers and vendors. So go to vendors and then click on this arrow where you would see further details. Then further drill down under control, you have define account groups. So we saw what are the different types of vendors. So let's go and see what are the different account groups that are available. Okay, the standard account groups that are available in SAP are 0001, which is standard vendor. Then you have 0002 goods supplier. Then you have various other vendors that have been defined by SAP. Now, if you need to have your own definition, or you want to create your own account group, you can go ahead and create an account group. So you can use any of the account groups that have been defined. You can select it and then you can create a copy. So if you go and create copy as, then the details get populated and then you can enter the new account group. Put in an account group 0101 and call them as domestic vendors. Okay. Now, once you enter these details, you can click on the save icon. And then you can create your own transport request. So you can just say vendor master creation. Or vendor master configuration. And click on save. Click on the green check. So now you have created the account group 0101 as domestic vendors. Okay. Now, once you create the account group, you can go back, and in case you want to define any particular specific field selection for the same, you select it and double click on it, and it opens a new window. And out here you see the field status. So suppose if you want to change some certain field status, you want to, under the general data category, you want to make changes. So if you go here to the general data category, you have address, communication, payment transactions, contact person. So say for example, you go to the payment transaction. See here, if you see, all the details are optional. Suppose if you want to make this bank details mandatory, you can go and select this radio button. So like this, you have an option to set the relevant fields, do all the relevant field settings. Once you complete all these things, go ahead and save it. Okay. Similarly, you can do the same for the rest of the field status, like the company code data, the purchasing sub-range, and purchasing plant. So any of these things, if you want to change the field status, you can double click on the relevant category and then go ahead and make changes to any of the groups here: account management group, payment transaction group. Double click on this and you have the option to either suppress it or make it a required entry, which is mandatory entry, make it optional, or only display. Once you make any change here, do not forget to save. Click on the save icon. Okay. So right now we are not making any changes here. Go ahead and save and then come out. Okay. So once you're done with the vendor account group definition, for each of this vendor account group, you need to go and define a number range. Okay. So click on define number range, go to intervals, and you need to select the interval so that it doesn't overlap. So if you look here, let us go and put a number from 500 to 600. So let's click on this and put in 16, which is 100 to now you can go ahead and save this. So you have created a number 16 from 500 to 699. Go ahead and save this. Click on green check. And once it is saved, click on this green arrow back. Come to the number range. Click on that. And the one that you have defined as a domestic vendor, 0101, you can go and put in your number range. Your number range is 16. So whenever you create a vendor using this account group 0101, this number range would come into effect. And this is an internal number range. Okay, go ahead and save it. Now, if you go back to the defined account groups, if you go back there and go to your account group that you have defined 0101, select it and look in the details. You see the system is automatically displays the number range that you have configured in the previous step here. Earlier, this field was blank. Click on save once again, just come out of this transaction. The next thing that you can configure is you can configure define screen layout specific to any purchase organization. Suppose if you have any specific screen layout that you want to do for any specific purchase organization, then you can define, put in the purchase organization. Once you define that purchase organization as a new entry, you can select it and look at the details. And then you have the field status option, the purchasing data, purchasing sub-range, purchasing plan. You can go to any of these categories, look at the selection group. So under purchasing data, if you double click again, you will be able to see the various purchasing data. Now out here, if you want to make terms of payment mandatory, okay, so you make it as a required entry. Purchase order currency mandatory, make it as a mandatory by selecting the relevant radio button. So this way you can make certain fields mandatory so that when a person is creating the vendor master, they can create they need to input the relevant fields, and only then the system will allow you to save it. Then go ahead and save this. Once you save this, you can come out of this transaction. Yeah. So these are the vendor master related configurations, and thank you for watching.